Welcome back, and let's continue the story of the kings. So we just had Romulus murdering his brother Remus. Great way to start off a kingship, right? All right, well, once he becomes king, he starts instituting some of the important institutions that will become part of Rome later. The most important one that he institutes is the Senate, and he does so by choosing 100 leading family members to become his elders, who will advise him. Senate is taken from the Roman word meaning an elderly man, and so it's a council of elders. Of course, nowadays we might think of senators as old men who are over the hill anyways, but in any event, the senators are elders who advise Romulus of how to rule the city. So Rome gets underway that way. Now, the difficulty that Romulus runs into, though, is that he insists that the senatorial families have to be separate from the general families. And the two words for, to describe those two groups are patrician, because the word for senator was originally patres in Latin, which is the word for fathers. Senators were considered to be the fathers of their country, and that's where we actually get the word patriot from. Patriot means literally the father of one's country, one's fatherland, essentially. So the senators are the fathers, and then everybody else are the plebs, the ordinary citizens. They could not intermarry with each other. So we end up with a difficulty, kind of like that we talked about before with many of the monarchies about inbreeding, and we also talked about with the Olympic gods. Remember that the families get too stuck in with each other. So Romulus tries to get outside tribes to come into Rome and to begin intermarrying with the senatorial families. And not surprisingly, because the Romulans are actually outsiders coming in, all of these outside families and tribes and cities refuse to have anything to do with them. It's important to pause here and emphasize the fact that the Romans, in fact, are outsiders. And so, by the way, are their northern neighbors, the Etruscans. We don't actually know precisely where, in fact, the original Romans really did come from. The Etruscans appear to have come from much further east, probably somewhere around the Black Sea. The Romans themselves appear to probably have come from many different places. The southern cities in Italy and also on Sicily were definitely Greek-based, because many Greeks in much earlier years sent colonists over there. But the Romans themselves do recognize that they are actually outsiders coming into Italy, and in fact, quite a bit of the myth of Aeneas about having Aeneas be the founder of that original colony that will later produce Rome is meant to politicize the fact that the Romans recognize themselves as outsiders, but they're justified outsiders. They in fact do belong there. Fate and the gods brought them there, and eventually allowed them to become the rulers of Italy and eventually of the whole Mediterranean world. Okay, so we have therefore Romulus recognized in his day as an outsider and being spurned by all of the neighboring cities. So what do we do to solve that problem? We trick all of those cities to send in all of their women together with their husbands to a big festival for the god Neptune in Rome. Once everybody is all assembled, a signal is given, and the leading Roman men sweep through the assembled crowd and grab all the women. This particular tribe was the Sabines, and this became, which is a neighboring tribe to the east, and that became known as the Rape of the Sabines. It was the way for Romulus to forcibly link the two groups together, as well as to repopulate his city. It led, not surprisingly, to a war between the Romans and the Sabines. According to Livy, the war was eventually resolved between Romulus and the king of the Sabines, Titus Tatius, by the women themselves in the middle of a battle, running out in the middle of the field and stopping the battle because they did not want to be simultaneously orphaned and widowed. Orphaned from their parents and the Sabines, and widowed from their new husbands in the Roman world. So they actually come to discover we're not actually such bad men after all. Well, of course, they're Romans. Why wouldn't they be? I mean, even if they did grab the Sabines in the middle of a festival that they were invited to in good faith, you know. So that's how that war ends up ending. In reality, though, we have independent evidence that suggests that Titus Tatius did actually manage to take over Rome for a time and might have been an additional king, but Livy manages to gloss over that possibility. Anyway, So with that, we have the established tradition that the Romans are able to put in place of forming alliances with all of their neighbors all through Italy. And it's through that means, as well as, of course, warfare and in real Roman history, that they're able to gradually expand. A lot of that is what happens here in the Republic. So eventually Romulus himself, after a long distinguished kingship, one day is grabbed up in a cloud of dust, which apparently was sent down to him by the god Mars, and is spirited up off to Mount Olympus, and that's what finally ends him. Livy casts doubt on the story, not surprisingly, and says that because Romulus was such a populist leader, the senators might have disliked him, and it's possible that eventually they assassinated him and then made up the story of the cloud of dust in order to cover an actual assassination. That certainly is possible. We don't have any other evidence to support that. But in any event, that is the end of Romulus's reign. What happens now is that the Senate comes up with another tradition called interregnum, in which there is a period of 1 year in which the Senate has to now choose the next king. In a way, it's kind of somewhat similar in modern days to the Vatican City with the Pope, when there's a need for the new Pope to be chosen. In any event, the Senate ends up choosing a new king, and we have Numa Pompilius, who is a religiously devout king who sets in place all of the religious institutions in Rome, including the high priest position of Pontifex Maximus in Latin, the high priest. That word pontifex is where we get the word pontiff from, which is another word for the Pope. After Numa Pompilius comes Tullus Hostilius, who is the first conqueror, the one who spreads out and goes all around him to conquer some of the nearby cities, including the colony of Alba Longa, not too far away. Also, Fidena is another city. After him comes Ancus Marcius, who continues additional conquests. After him, we have 3 Etruscan kings. We have first Tullius Priscus. Tarquinius Priscus, excuse me. The family is called the Tarquin family. So we have Tarquinius Priscus, the first one. Then we have Servius Tullius, who is the one who sets up the entire census system in Rome, which establishes the citizenships and voting. And then finally, the really murderous one is Tarquinius Superbus. He is the one who, in fact, is the most violently minded one. He actually does end up still with quite a long rule, but he gets in due to the assassination of Servius Tullius, his predecessor, that's instituted by his wife Tanaquil. And once he's in power, then he ends up really cracking down almost in a reign of terror against any of his political enemies. Again, he's quite a violently minded king. He himself ends up going into exile, but that happens because of his son Sextus Tarquinius. What Sextus does is an act that's somewhat reminiscent of what Paris does to Helen in Sparta. Getting Helen out of Sparta and taking her off to Troy, and that's of course what starts the Trojan War. What happens here is that Sextus Tarquinius, the son of Tarquinius Superbus, is serving in the army with 2 other men who are all having an argument about which of their wives is the most chaste. So the man named Collatinus says, "You need to all come to my house and visit with my wife Lucretia." So after that particular campaign ends, all the men do indeed come together to Collatinus' house. They all meet Lucretia, and Lucretia turns out indeed to be the most chaste of all the wives that they know, because she's very nicely taking care of her domestic affairs and weaving and everything else. And so she's the model of chastity for the Romans at this point. Sextus Tarquinius lays eyes on her and immediately falls in love, we should say lust for her. Later, Sextus arranges to become an ambassador, traveling through, and manages to stay at Collatinus' house as a trusted guest, unfortunately, because in the middle of the night, Sextus sneaks out of bed and sneaks into Lucretia's bedroom and holds her at knife point and forces her to submit to him. And the next day, Lucretia is so ashamed of what has happened to her that she confesses what has happened to her husband and father, and right then and there commits suicide. This horrible act is what brings down the monarchy, because Collatinus teams up with another member of the family Lucius Junius Brutus, who is in fact the ancestor of the famous Marcus Junius Brutus, the assassin of Julius Caesar in 44 BC. Lucius Junius Brutus and Collatinus team up in order to get rid of the monarchy, and that is how they established the Roman Republic. I should once again point out, however, that there is evidence to suggest that another man, Lars Porsena, was in fact a later king, and there might have even been a period also when Tarquinius Superbus got back in power temporarily as well. So the history is kind of clouded at this point. But the official history as we have it is that in 510 BC, Tarquinius Superbus is ejected from power as a consequence of the villainous act of his son Sextus Tarquinius. 509 BC is when the two consuls are now established as the new form of power, and that's what transfers over from the kingship to the republic. Now, a word needs to be said here again about these dates. The date 753 BC is supposed to have been the date when Romulus and Remus together founded the city of Rome. The problem is that that is a calculation based on that done by a 1st century BC scholar named Varro. Now, Varro was a brilliant erudite scholar who wrote many works that unfortunately are now lost to us. But it's clear that he did quite a bit of ancient studies, with as much evidence as he was able to do, kind of like Livy did for his history, and put forward mounds and mounds of scholarly information. Unfortunately, too much for us to get today, and that included a study of Roman antiquity. The problem, however, is that 753 BC appears to have been an artificial calculation. It's the one that Livy himself uses for his own history, which is why we need to know it in order to understand and use it in order to understand Roman history. But there's no actual reason to accept this date for any other reason, because in fact it conflicts with a lot of the archaeological evidence mentioned before for the foundation of Rome with these villages. So it's unlikely that this date 753 BC has any real historicity. Similarly, 510 BC and 509 BC are just as suspicious, because if you remember from the Athenian history portion of this course, those are the dates when we have the expulsion first of Hippias the tyrant, and then thereafter the foundation of democracy in ancient Athens. So there may have been a rather neat coincidence here of dates trying to get these two events to correspond. So we can't really be sure if this works either. What is clear, though, is that by the mid-5th century BC, the 400s BC, the Republic is in place with two consuls. That we can tell because we have a list of all the consuls starting in the 450s BC by these Roman lists called the Fasti, A-F-A-S-T-I, which are religious lists of names, and that includes the consular names for each year, which is the way that the Romans also dated their years. And so therefore we can tell that the consular form of government was definitely in place by the 400s BC. So the date 509 BC is certainly plausible. It does fit the history approximately, but we have to be somewhat careful of it because of this correspondence with the Athenian history date. Okay, so that's what goes on with the kingship. And a little final point of moralizing to mention about this is that when Tullus Hostilius was going to have somebody as an ally to help him out, but then that ally didn't appear at the battle the way he was supposed to be until at the very end when he was sure that it was going to be a win. The way he got rewarded was to be attached to 4 chariots and pulled apart by the horses, basically being quartered. Livy puts that in his history in order to say, you see, this is back in the old barbaric days. We are not uncivilized like that today. So that's one of the points Livy is trying to make, was to show these old barbaric ways of the kings that are given up in later, much better days under the Republic and then eventually the Empire. So again, you have to keep that in mind, the way that the Romans construct their history. Okay, in the next video, we're all set with the kingship, and we're going to turn to the Republic. Come on right back for the next video.